Dracula's Servant. A short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Reproduced below for readers' consideration is the unaltered text of a letter discovered amongst our collections in December of 1927. The letter is addressed to a Dr. John Seward, administrator of the Seward Sanatorium, and was handwritten by the noted psychiatrist Dr. Arthur P. Dowd, himself the administrator of a similar institution, the Dowd and Low Sanatorium, which operated in London up until the latter doctor's mysterious disappearance in late August of 1890. The letter, which was never sent and was donated to our library alongside Dr. Dowd's other papers, is not dated, though it is thought to have been composed some time in that same year. Whilst many regard the letter to be a work of fiction, and perhaps a fragment from what was intended to be the draft of some epistolary novel, a number of factors would seem to contradict this assumption. Firstly, the fact that the letter had been placed inside an envelope, addressed, and sealed. Secondly, records showing quite clearly that Dr. Dowd did have under his care a patient by the name of Granach. And finally, police records detailing the discovery of a body on the property of the sanatorium, later identified to have been Dr. Christopher Mallon, who was thought to have fallen and broken his neck. What became of Dr. Dowd remains a mystery. Dr. A. Waite, Department of Public Records, The British Library, March 1929. My dear Dr. Seward, before I begin this missive, I must first take the time to implore you, particularly if you are alone within the walls of the sanatorium after dark as you read this, to please take the time to lock and barricade the doors of your room until you have finished reading. Please, for my sake, and that of your loved ones, humor me in this matter, and return to this letter only once you have done as I ask. If you have taken the necessary measures, then I shall begin my story. Forced, as I now am, to reflect upon and give my own account of these events, I cannot help but apportion the greatest measure of blame to myself. I am, indeed, resigned to the fact that should I live beyond this night, I shall be forevermore marked with those indelible stains of remorse. Remorse that I did not act with more haste, and that in the condescending certainty of the unbeliever I ignored the warnings of those around me, disregarding them either as irrational or foolish. For disbelief was indeed my steadfast position. Only now, regarding those events in the blinding clarity of hindsight's scathing illumination, do I shudder and blush to consider with what short shrift I dismissed Christopher's claims, how readily I refused to believe, and how, with that one wicked bout of incredulity, I acted, however unwittingly, as servant and helper to a dark and malevolent master. It is for this reason that I beg you, dear John, to reserve judgment upon my words until they are through and exhausted. For whilst it would be all too easy for you to fall into the same trap as I, and succumb to your own natural skepticism, I ask you, for now at least, to resist. I write to you by way of both a confession and a warning, knowing as I do that you have experienced similar circumstances. I ask only that you respond with more wisdom and grace than I did. I ask you to listen, and then, if heaven grants you the time, to act. When first you shared with me your experiences and observations of your patient R. M. Renfield, I was understandably unnerved by what you referred to as his zoophagous tendencies, but did not at the time allow myself to reveal to you just how interested I was in your patient and your work. Indeed, whilst I remember questioning you quite thoroughly on the topic, I also recall that I was reluctant to express too deep an interest, lest you might suspect that within the narrow stone walls of my own sanatorium I was housing an individual who had displayed the very same habits. Why I did not simply share this fact with you at the time, so that we might compare notes and work together to further our understanding is, I am sure you will already have guessed, a decision I can only blame upon my own professional pride. With your naming and labeling of this observed psychosis, however informally, you had jumped the gun, claiming for yourself the plaudits and recognition that would surely accompany such a leap forward in our understanding, if and when you decided to publish your findings. Findings that would have both overtaken and outshone my own meagre efforts in this area. It was, in short, that green-eyed monster jealousy that prevented me from sharing my observations. For this I can only apologize. Had I known or even suspected that a far more literal monster, whose eyes glow red rather than green, was waiting in the wings, I would gladly have told you everything. As it is, I am only now able to share with you my findings, far too late for both the patient and his attendant. I share them in the hope that upon reading them you will endeavor to expel without a moment's delay from your sanatorium that wretched patient you call Renfield. For I assure you, with the utmost sincerity, that this action must be taken promptly. Not only must you dismiss him to whatever authority would be willing to take him, but in ridding yourself of this patient, you must be sure to remove any and all insects or other creatures he may have amassed for himself. Believe me when I tell you, dear John, that they are more dangerous than you think. Of my own Renfield, a man named Granach, I can tell you the following. Granach, I was never able to correctly ascertain the man's first name, came to us in late '89, but only began to display his penchant for devouring flies around 4 months ago. I first observed the habit after noticing that each day Granach would smear and plaster a thin layer of the porridge we provided to him as food onto the ledge of his barred window. He would then sit, patiently like a fisherman watching his bait, and wait for flies, tempted by the nourishment, to come. When one such insect would venture into the cell, Granach, who had been waiting with an almost statue-like stillness, would propel himself suddenly forward, springing towards the ledge with the sort of feline speed and ferocity that you would not have credited the man with having possessed. What was striking about this process was that Granach would not swat or kill the flies, but rather would carefully and meticulously remove several of their legs before popping them into a small matchbox that he had requested one of the guards to let him have the previous month. He would repeat this entire routine over and over until the sun went down, at which time he would retire to the corner of his room and sit hunched over his tiny captives as they flitted and buzzed against the walls of their cardboard prison. All night he would sit with a stamina only granted to the insane, wide awake, poking and prodding at his still living pets. At length he requested a small tin in which to keep his growing collection of captives, and, seeing no harm, whilst also interested to see what he might do with them, I granted the request. By the end of that month, the tin was so full, crammed almost to the top with plump, tiny bodies piled atop one another, that it almost resembled a quart of raisins. Indeed, I have personally sat at one end of the long stone corridors of my institution and listened from the other end of the hallway as Granach whispered to his small tin, which, despite the short lifespan of its inhabitants, and the fact that they were so crammed in that you would have thought them all flattened and crushed, nevertheless buzzed and hummed softly in response. I am not a man who scares easily, but I will admit that on a few of those nights, in the wee hours when the hush takes the world beneath its cloak and sound is muted, the soft rustling echo of those baleful whispers, curling and winding themselves like eddies of smoke around the dull, repetitive hum from that tin, did make my hair stand on end. I was reminded always of those tales of the desert tribes who would from every meal offer one small piece of meat to the barren waste itself, leaving a feast for the god of the flies. Did you, I wonder, Dr. Seward, in your own lonely vigils in quiet halls, with shadows creeping long about you, think such thoughts as these? Would you also confess to having more than once checked over your shoulder into the darkened space behind? Of course, whenever I looked, I found nothing there. Still, I was not the only one who was unnerved by Granach's strange whispers. On the contrary, one morning when I arrived for an early visit, I was greeted by a terrified young doctor under my employ by the name of Christopher. This man, I should clarify, was, like myself, not one prone to flights of fancy. Yet he swore, with a pale cheek and a cold sweat beading his brow, that the previous night, having walked the corridor's length and approached the final cell where Granach was being held, that he had heard the man no longer whispering, but frantically talking with some excitement, presumably to his flies. What had startled young Christopher, and had, he said, turned his legs to water, was that as he approached, he had also heard another voice gently talking back. Frozen to the spot, Christopher said that rather than approaching the cell, he had leaned ever so slightly forward in the hope of seeing who Granach might be talking to, hoping that he would find the lunatic alone, practicing some strange form of ventriloquism. What he saw instead was Granach seated on the edge of his bed. Across him, and stretched back so that it covered the wall behind, was the shadow of another man, and yet Christopher swore on all that was good and dear to him, there was no other there. Granach was talking to a shadow that could not possibly have been cast. Naturally, I dismissed Christopher's story as ludicrous, suggesting that perhaps he might himself consult a doctor before he ended up occupying a cell of his own. I did resolve, however, to increase and refine the focus of my own observations, to set myself up outside his cell, rather than at the end of the corridor where I had previously been ensconced. This resolution became firmer still when I came to call on Granach later that day and found lying beside him a completely empty tin. He had eaten every single fly. Over the course of the next few days, Granach attempted to replenish his stocks. Unfortunately, his own newly acquired appetite for the tiny insects overruled his desire to keep and preserve them. Every time a juicy specimen was captured, he would remove the legs, scurry off toward his tin, seemingly with the intention of popping them inside. As he approached the tin, however, he would stop dead, stare for a moment at the squirming bug between his fingers, and would then slip it, still buzzing between his lips, and swallow. In the course of a week I observed Granach consume several scores of flies. On one occasion he spent the entire night drawing a huge black circle onto the wall of his cell with a piece of charcoal he had acquired from somewhere. Over and over, at an arm's length, he repeated these strange orbits, so the space at the centre remained blank and clear, whilst all around was circle after smudged circle of black. When, finally, he came to the last remnants of his drawing materials, he stood back, regarded the blank circle like a bright moon in the clear night sky, and then, with an admirable talent, drew in its centre a candle with a burning flame. The effect, admittedly, was quite striking. Now the untouched area became the glow from the candle, throwing out a disk of light into the surrounding black. Just as I thought he had finished, however, Granach stood back and began slowly to open his mouth, stretching his jaws wider than ever I would have believed possible. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, knowing all the while that he was being observed, he reached with 4 fingers into the cavern of his mouth and produced from somewhere a single, still buzzing fly. Approaching the wall, he snickered to himself gleefully and held this fly up to the drawing. He then circled it over and over, as if it were turning tiny revolutions around the flame, then slammed it all at once into the wall, where it left, to my surprise, a deep red stain, as a mosquito from the tropics might, if crushed after it has fed. He then crouched, huddled in the corner, and began to mutter the same nonsensical mantra over and over. "Moth to a flame, coming and drawn, coming and drawn. He's coming, you know, and we'll come to him. Moth to a flame, moth to a flame." Where these jabbered ravings caught my attention more keenly was with the mention of a very particular name, a striking name that I remembered all too well from our brief conversations. The name of a patient under your own care, Dr. Seward. I am sure you can guess the name. It was the name Renfield. "Moth to a flame and Renfield. Renfield and I. Renfield and I. We are chosen. We are saved, Renfield and I. He's coming, you know, on high, darkened waves and padded canine feet. He's coming." I will swear 1,000 oaths that never during my interactions with Granach did I mention or even allude to your patient. It seems unlikely to me that they knew each other in some previous capacity, and even if this were the case, how strange and striking a coincidence it was that he should conjure from the many names of those with whom he had been acquainted before the madness took hold, the name, the very name, of a patient with near identical behaviors. More worrying still than these strange mutterings, however, were the physical changes in Granach. Though he continued to eat his ration just as he had, saving a small portion to lure more flies, and was, in fact, supplementing his diet with a steady stream of insect morsels, the weight was noticeably dropping and sloughing off him. So much weight did the poor man shed that his cheeks became sunken, his face drawn and gaunt, with the bones of his jaw and clavicles jutting out like the emerging edge of some structure half buried in the sand. He became listless, skeletal in appearance, and hardly moving through weakness. He would oscillate between not speaking at all and shrieking wildly, opening his mouth only to blame the flies for his condition. In his mind, it was always the flies. "They cling to me. He clings and drinks. They're taking out the blood, and the blood is the life." Again and again he would say it, insisting with ever greater fervor that it was the flies that were to blame, that rather than him consuming them, it was in fact they who were eating, or somehow drinking, him. In a curious linguistic flourish, he would refer at all times to the flies as if they were a single body, one entity or a distinct personality all of their own, always in his thin, whispered rasp, always insisting that it was the flies. "The flies. He clings and drinks. The blood, the life. The blood is the life." Sometimes he would lift his shirt, showing me the thin layer of translucent skin stretched across his ribs, and would point as if I would see some bite or mark upon the skin. "Here!" he'd scream, pointing to himself. "Here! He's here! I've let him in! He's here!" Eventually I asked Christopher to physically examine him, to disabuse Granach of his delusion, and of course to satisfy my own records that there was no externally observable reason for his drastic weight loss. no infection caused by a horsefly bite or place where flies might be attached to the man's pathetic, emaciated body. No hidden flies that might, as he insisted, be sucking him dry of his lifeblood. Reluctantly, Christopher performed the examination, looking over every inch of my Renfield's pitiful frame, all whilst he continued to bawl. Renfield and I, we are chosen, saved. I've let him in. He's in here. At length, Christopher confirmed that, whilst Granach was clearly suffering some form of starvation or wasting disease, and there had been a marked deterioration in his health, his body was unblemished. There were no puncture marks or swollen lumps consistent with having been bitten by an insect or any other animal for that matter. Whatever was happening to him, it was unrelated to the flies. I tried as best I could to explain this to Granach, but of course he wouldn't listen. A few days later, Granach sadly passed away. Eager to know what had been the cause of his untimely death, I asked Christopher to examine the body and perform something of a post-mortem. The operation itself took place in the cellar room below the main ward, a small, windowless room with thick stone walls that we used as an infirmary when the patients became unwell or happened to do themselves or others a mischief. Equipped with a stone slab that served as operating table and furnished with the instruments required for such work, the room had also, on occasion, been used as a makeshift morgue until such time as the bodies of departed patients could be properly dealt with. I recall quite clearly that as Christopher opened the door and descended the steps towards this room, his own bag of surgical tools clutched in one hand, he threw me a look of such empty desolation that for a moment I did consider performing the operation myself. The man was terrified. In the weeks since his encounter with Granach's strange shadow, Christopher had become somewhat withdrawn and subdued. Whenever I asked him to perform some duty that involved Granach, even in the clear light of day, he would flinch and cower like an often-kicked dog, and, though he would diligently perform his duties, his reluctance was clear. Still, he could not have thought to have been harmed by Granach now that he had expired, and dutifully descended the stairs to perform the task as requested. It was less than half an hour later that I heard the hideous scream. Racing back up the stairs, one hand clasped over his mouth, Christopher ran towards me and pointed with one outstretched arm towards the stone steps. "The flies," he said finally. "They killed him." Rising from my seat and not a little irritated by Christopher's disruptive and frankly irrational behavior, I began at once to walk towards the steps that led down to the infirmary. "Nonsense, man," I scolded. "Today is Friday. Was it not only on Monday of this week that you examined the poor wretch? And was it not also on Monday, but a few days ago, that you assured me there were no fly bites on Granach's person?" Christopher stared silently, his arms dangling limply by his sides. "Yes," he said finally, in a voice that seemed more breath than sound. "There were no fly bites when I examined him." "Well then," I said, lifting my own bag of instruments and walking briskly towards the stairs. "But," Christopher muttered softly, "that was on the outside." I stopped dead in my tracks. What Christopher then described to me was, I would have said up until that point, impossible. Nevertheless, I record here for posterity's sake. Outlining his actions in sequence, he explained how he had first examined the outside of the body, taking careful notes, but saw no cause of death evident from external factors. He had therefore decided that a more invasive procedure was necessary. Cutting down the meridian line of the chest and belly, he made his incision and, with some effort, folded back, like heavy flaps of leather, the layers of skin and fat to allow him to examine the internal organs. As he performed this action, however, he became aware all at once of a dull, low, buzzing sound. Peeling back the sides, he was horrified to see the inside of Granach's body studded all over with the swollen bodies of hundreds upon hundreds of fat, black flies, every one of them not only alive, but fastened on, clamped via their mouth and some awful proboscis to the interior walls, the fat and the very organs of the man. "After all," said Christopher almost in a faint, staring blankly into the middle distance, "he never chewed them. Never once did he chew. He swallowed them whole and let them inside. He wasn't eating them. He was letting them eat him." When I protested that the acids of the stomach, the squeeze and mash of the digestive tract, would crush and dissolve the tiny bodies, and that there was no question of them surviving inside the human body, Christopher became wild with agitation. "Go then," he shouted. "Go then and see for yourself that I am not delusional." For a few seconds after this outburst, an icy, silent stillness lay between us. I stared coldly into his eyes. Resolving that this frosty atmosphere should not harden and stretch to a glacier's length, I instead decided to humor him. I nodded to signal that I would acquiesce to his wishes and examine the body myself, expecting, of course, to find nothing that would match Christopher's outlandish claims. Perhaps some staining on the organs, some clot of blood or bruising that would have appeared like specks of black in the meagre light thrown by his lamp, but certainly no flies. As I opened the door leading down to the cellar and slowly began to descend those steps, I will admit to having been somewhat apprehensive. Clambering cautiously down, with Christopher close behind, clutching a second paraffin lamp, I could not exorcise from my mind the image of grave robbers descending into some family crypt, scrabbling amongst the tombs in search of treasures held fast by the clutches of the dead. My unease was not helped by the sudden hush that had fallen upon the place. The other patients, or at least those who had not been sleeping, were chastened into silence by Christopher's outburst, and were now waiting with quiet curiosity to see what might unfold. The rest of the building was silent, such that each heavy footfall upon the stone steps seemed to echo and reverberate around the place, until, finally, it was smothered and swallowed by the hush. With slow, cautious steps, I gingerly took the turn at the bottom of the staircase and entered the cellar room. What I saw there will haunt me until my dying day. For there, in the cellar, curved and hunched over the slab, where the body of poor Granach lay prone, was a thing that, though it loosely held the proportions of a man, was in fact nothing of the sort. The figure, a warped, ill-made mockery of human form, was of a blackness the likes of which I have never seen, like a thing made entirely of ink or a thick and viscous oil. Yet even this shadowed outline was not fixed, for the thing, I realized in an instant, was not a single body at all, but rather a collection. It was a shape made up of flies. Hundreds, thousands of tiny black bodies, melting and moving over one another as the thick bristling hairs of their legs created in their squirming movements a hideous, whispered rustling that could still be heard beneath the constant throbbing hum. At first, I thought that the flies were covering something solid, that they had clustered together, as bees sometimes will on the arms of a keeper to form a thick carpet of tiny bodies, but this was not the case. For as the thing moved and shifted, so too did the mass of flies, so that at points the outline was broken and spaces, huge empty patches of transparent air where the swarm had broken up, were visible. In the thing's hand, an immense mitt with thin, elongated fingers, Granach's head rested, limp. His neck hung below in the drooping slackness of post-rigor mortis. Upon our entrance, the thing's massive head, if it should be labelled as such, had turned slowly to face us, and somewhere within that skittering mass I saw the pinpoint glow of 2 ruby eyes. I screamed, and turning back towards the stairs, fought and scrambled for freedom, as Christopher, who had been behind me, instead of retreating, stepped forward, fumbling hurriedly at his pockets. What he had planned to produce from them, what tool or weapon he believed he could find that would tame this thing, I cannot imagine, but whatever it was, it failed. For as I stumbled towards the top step, my frantic wailing, echoed and mimicked by the braying inmates who, like wolves prompted by a single hound, had joined in chorus to support my howls of terror, I heard behind me, above all else, the awful sound of a dull, wet snap. Christopher, I knew, was already dead. I slammed the door closed and hurriedly affixed a lock. When I began this missive, I told you that what I intended to pen was a confession, not of things I have done, but rather, as I recite from the pews each Sunday morning, of things that I have failed to do. In disbelieving Christopher, I ushered him hurriedly towards his hideous fate, and, whilst it is true that it was not my own hand that snapped his neck, mine remains a hand from which the blood shall not easily be washed. I waited until morning and several hours still before re-entering that room. I have wondered whether I should have gone back for Christopher, whether I should have remained, stood my ground and fought. Seeing his body the following morning, seeing the terror on his face, and the queer and unnatural angle at which his neck was bent, I am satisfied that I would have offered little in the way of resistance, and only assisted this fiend in claiming another victim. When, finally, I amassed the courage to enter that room once more, I found no flies, no figure formed of insects and shadows. Only the cold, limp remnants of my friend and colleague alongside the withered, dried-out husk of what had once been my patient. That body, so drained of its nutrients that it no longer looked human, appeared for all the world like a piece of cracked and aged leather. I decided to dispose of it before I informed the constabulary. Please understand, Dr. Seward, that this was not simply an attempt to cover my tracks and absolve myself of responsibility. Rather, it was an instinct, driven in part by memories of a book I once read concerning the legends and folklore of Eastern Europe. Tales I half recalled of men becoming prey, who then, in turn, were themselves cursed to predate. Whilst Christopher's neck was twisted and crushed, Granach's was newly decorated with 2 small puncture wounds that had not been there before. The body of Granach, over the course of several laborious hours, I sawed, dismembered, and burned. At first light tomorrow, I intend to alert the authorities to Christopher's death. Do not for a moment suppose that my intention in delaying this contact is malicious. I already bear the weight upon my conscience of one death. I do not intend to bring others here during the hours of darkness, to be fed upon by creatures that seem themselves to be made up of the dark. Tomorrow, in the light of day, tomorrow I shall bring them. As for Christopher, I shall tell the authorities, in keeping with the nature of his injuries, that he must have fallen on the steps and broken his neck, for, of course, I can never tell them, without myself ending up in a sanatorium, the true horror of what I have witnessed. To unburden myself of that load, I must, I regret, turn to you, in the dim hope that you will heed my warning, that you will not, as I did, dismiss such tales as fanciful nonsense, and that you will expel from your care without hesitation that fly-eating wretch called Renfield, as soon as you possibly can. He is a danger, John. He and the one he obeys. I pray also that having done this, and having read my words, you might appeal and beg to whatever and whichever authority you know that might be able to assist you in identifying and vanquishing this great evil that I fear has landed upon our shores. As for myself, I shall conclude this letter, send it by first post tomorrow, and wait in quiet hope for your response. It is now approaching the hour of 5, and soon enough the sun will set. Who can say what horrors the darkness shall bring in its wake? Yours, Arthur. This has been Dracula's Servant, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.